In the 1950s, the world was amidst a Cold War that pitted between the West pro-American capitalist group or the Soviet socialist bloc. Developing countries had to choose which bloc to belong to, which usually came with consequences. However, the 1955 Bandung Conference saw developing nations required to follow 10 principles, some of which include respect for human rights, respect for sovereignty and territorial rights for all nations, recognition of independence movements, abstaining from intervention in the internal affairs of another country, and respect for justice and international obligations.
It led to independence of the then colonized countries. As you know, from the 1960s and 70s were the decades of independence, and many of the African countries became independent around that period, which was spearheaded by the non-aligned movement.
It was able to bring together, especially developing countries, to be on talking terms and also to understand one another. All the way from Yugoslavia to India to Indonesia to African countries, it was able to bring them together. The second achievement was that soon after independence, especially of most African countries during the 1960s, they were able to find an international space where they would belong without finding themselves dragged into competition and conflict between the great powers.
In 1964, they set up the G77 to reflect the interests of the non-aligned countries in negotiating with the global north on economic issues.
On the back of the Bandung Conference principles in 1961, the non-aligned movement was established in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, under the auspices of Yugoslav President Josip Tito, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, and Indonesian President Sukarno. In the early 60s, there were major successes to the movement's international policy of decolonization, disarmament, opposition to racism, and opposition to apartheid in South Africa. Every African country is a member of the non-aligned movement. Other countries such as China, Russia, Mexico, Argentina, and the Vatican City hold observer status in the movement, which represents about 55% of the world's population.
The non-aligned movement is a non-structured international institution. A non-structured institution is one where there is no permanent secretariat or structural employment base where there are people who are dedicated to doing certain things within this organization. Compared to the African Union, for example, which has a secretariat in Addis Ababa, employees who do everyday work. The non-aligned movement works in rotational basis. If, for instance, Uganda is going to take over the leadership of the movement in January this year, it means Uganda is going to act as the secretariat. The mission in New York, working with the mission in Addis Ababa and the Kampala office, will be running the affairs of the non-aligned movement.
With the professed end of the Cold War on December 25, 1991, the non-aligned movement shifted its focus towards fostering multilateral ties and unity among developing nations, particularly in the Global South, to strengthen its political leverage when negotiating with developed nations. The non-aligned movement now identifies economic underdevelopment, poverty, social injustices as growing threats to peace and security. However, even with the movement redefining itself, there are still challenges. For instance, cohesion between the different countries is a problem because of the divergence of their agendas and allegiances. There have been several conflicts between member states requiring foreign intervention, which breaks the rule of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries.
And what makes the non-aligned even much more significant are the principles: non-interference, independence of states, and ensuring that the right to development. These are the causes of conflict. But once conflicts happen, then the UN and particularly the UN Security Council are supposed to provide the way to resolve that conflict.
These conflicts include the 1978 invasion of Uganda by Tanzania, the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, which deeply divided the movement, Uganda support factions in Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan, in the late 1990s to 2000s, all these interventions led to unconstitutional changes of government.
Mistrust and suspicion between the West and the East is growing and worsening. The Americans, for example, do not trust the Russians anymore, even when they were permanent members of the UN Security Council, even when they together fought against the Germans and their allies and Japan in World War II. They don't trust. They don't trust each other. Today, the Americans and the Chinese don't trust each other in terms of what the interests and pursuits and goals of each is, and they are competing against certain spaces. They would like to dominate certain spaces.
The lack of cohesion is also noticeable on particular international issues, such as the war in Ukraine, as well as the Israeli-Hamas war, for which almost all members are non-committal.
What we have now is a paralysis, as we have seen. A paralysis in Palestine, a paralysis in Ukraine, because the system that was established cannot function. The permanent members cannot agree because each of them has a veto. And this has heightened the significance of the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement as a force must come out now and provide the directive to resolve these conflicts.
I think the most difficult task and assignment of the day is for the NAM members to convince the big powers, France, Britain, China, Russia, and the USA, to allow the UN system to be reformed so that other regions, other countries can have permanent membership on the UN Security Council. And Africa, especially the African Union, together with the NAM, have been pushing for these reforms now for about 2 decades.
The movement has also failed to align itself in the contemporary issues of today, such as Western hegemony, neocolonialism, and the systematic coup d'etats in West Africa. Instead, countries are now choosing to align to the West or Russia and China. Increasingly today, with the acceleration of great power competition, member states are being caught between pandering to the United States, Russia, and China. However, on some positions of the non-aligned movement has been vocal in instances such as reforming the United Nations Security Council, criticism of U.S. foreign policy like the 2003 invasion on Iraq, and attempts to stifle Iran and North Korea's nuclear plans, and on sustainable developments, cultural diversity, especially in the light of the homosexuality movement. This month, Azerbaijan will hand over the presidency of the non-aligned movement to Uganda 5 years after it took up office. The 19th summit will be held under the theme Deepening Cooperation for Shared Global Affluence. The Uganda chairmanship will last until 2027.